Good morning. This is Debra V. Wilson. I am in Canada. It is the 6th of March 2018, Tuesday. The time is 800 hours and 35 minutes, and that's GMT minus 6. Today I'm again exploring how and why terrorism is defined the way it is. Recently, it was actually a week ago, I saw a YouTube video from Vice, which I'm going to post, literally entitled DIY Gunshot Treatment on Chicago's South Side. As I mentioned before, I'm from the South Side of Chicago. I grew up in a community called Woodlawn. To give you reference and further contextualize the time I was there, I left the South Side of Chicago right before I turned 40, and I am 60 years old. The premise behind the YouTube video is the lack of consistent medical treatment, trauma one level medical treatment in Chicago, South Side communities. And what those dynamics have produced, and one of the dynamics that's produced according to this YouTube video, is private citizens taking care of gunshot wounds. Of course, there's the overriding bigger issue why there's so much gun violence in Chicago, but that gets into, for me, how and why we define terror. This morning I refreshed myself again and reacclimated myself again and the common definition of terrorism, and I will provide the sources for all of these utterances. And terrorism is defined briefly: the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political arms. With that, I question how we are defining terrorism, and the context is the U.S. I should have said that. So when I was young, so we're going to go from my teens to my 20s, I remembered the indignities, big and small, that we encountered in the neighborhood in which I lived in. There was a lot of gun violence that surrounded the community because of the gang there, which at that time was the Blackstone Rangers. I think their name has changed, I'm not sure. But in any case, so we had the indignity of, we didn't have convenience stores or tiny stores, very, very tiny mom and pop stores that didn't sell everything you need. So you often had to go outside of the community. We didn't have street lights because the gangs would shoot them out. We had them, but they weren't operating, and it was often too dangerous for the city to come in to fix them. If you had the economic, one of the ways in which middle class people or lower middle class people who are property owners fund a move to a new location to sell the current home they live in. That was very difficult in the neighborhood I lived in. So even if you were a property owner, mobility was difficult because the seed money you needed to buy a new home was tied up in the fact that no one would purchase a place in the community in which I lived, which is, by the way, Woodlawn. So they were, the older I get, the more I look back on that experience and all the indignities and inconveniences. Little things like you couldn't go out for a walk after eating dinner in the summertime. Lovely summers in Chicago. It'd be a bit humid, but you might like to go out and walk in the evening after you've had your dinner. You couldn't do that. You couldn't get a taxi. The yellow cabs and checker cabs didn't like to come into my neighborhood, so those were the licensed cabs. So we had to use jitney cab services that were owned. Many times they were unlicensed. Sometimes they were owned by individuals. So you had to navigate that system, and hopefully you were connected to a jitney cab driver who was ethical and showed up when they were supposed to show up. So there was that. We couldn't get, it was very difficult to get things like pizza delivery. These are the little indignities as well as the big ones that I'm going to give you a bit of an inventory of. You couldn't order pizza. You couldn't order Chinese food. You couldn't order any food because no one would volunteer to come in at night. It took years for our community to find a pizza delivery company, a pizza restaurant that would deliver, and the delivery service, the man showed up with a pistol and wouldn't come. If you lived in an apartment building, which was not the case for me, but if you lived in an apartment building, you had to stand outside because he wasn't going to come into the apartment complex. And then big indignities, like sometimes paramedics didn't show up and you didn't know they weren't going to show up because the city policy at that time was if it was not safe for the paramedics to come in, they weren't going to come in. And in my neighborhood, they often didn't come in unless they had police accompanying them. So if the police weren't available, they didn't come in. So there were people in my community that if they had a medical emergency, Allah willing, you got in a car and someone drove you to the hospital. Or if you didn't have a car, you hopefully, again, Allah willing, the jitney taxi service, you call them and they would actually take you to the hospital, big and small. So when I saw this video, which is just a week old, it's 2018, indignities great and small. So when I think about terrorism and that definition, one of the other things that terrorism does in my mind is it inspires fear. And then the other thing it does is it inconveniences you, right? So I've been an international traveler for 3 decades. I remember, over 3 decades actually. I remember getting on a plane years ago to fly to Europe, and I just literally almost just here's my boarding card, here you go, and I get on the plane. And now we know what we need to go through to get on an airplane, particularly out of cities like Chicago's O'Hare Airport, which is the airport I flew out of at that time. And then I think in Chicago about the inconveniences of living in certain neighborhoods, big and small. I've listed some of those. And I think about the fear that when I had a career, I'm a businesswoman, and I remember after work functions, if I dared to attend them, I was always watching my watch the time because I wanted to make sure I got back to catch the bus stop to catch the last express bus, because the option of taking a taxi from downtown Chicago to the part of Woodlawn in which I lived, so I had to take the city bus. And then the city bus, even the express bus, let me off at the closest I was let off from my home was over a block, and the gangs had shot out the street lights, okay? So, and it's not necessarily, I was never targeted by the gang, but the crossfire. You had to be concerned about that. So those little indignities, big and small. And the fear, the perpetual fear that you can't go out at night, you can't run an errand at night, you can't go to the grocery store at night, you can't, so you can't get the pizza place to come to you, but you can't go out to get the pizza either at night, that you have to do everything. You're the reverse of vampires. We used to joke about that. You had to do everything in the daylight, because the moment it started getting dark, if you had to be out, then God pray. If you had to be out, you had a job, for some reason you had to go out at night, pray. Get your prayer on. Indignities great and small. The fear, the perpetual fear. So then I ask myself, why isn't what's happening in Chicago called terrorism. There's some political narratives around the formation of gangs and the maintenance of the gang's brand identity and the gang itself. Most of those narratives have to do with issues of class, identity, and gender, but so do the narratives around groups that we define as terrorist groups. There is grooming / radicalization that we acknowledge that happens in what we call terrorism, but it also happens in street gangs, and the street gangs are fueling a lot of the violence in Chicago. So why is one crime and the other terror? So one of my theories is, I think that, and again, the context is the USA. I think there are lots of Americans terrorized by the concept of terrorism. I know for a fact there are lots of Chicagoans, black and brown, who are terrorized daily. The exercise of living, the entire activity of living their lives is the containment of their fear and terror about what might happen, because they live in insecure places. So why isn't that terrorism? So in the U.S., the way terrorism, the rare instances of terrorism, in the way that's currently defined, is to hit valuable objects, people, places, right? Airports, government buildings, iconic symbols. And the obvious reason they choose to do that is because they're of value. So for an ISIS-backed or Al-Qaeda-backed organization to bomb the neighborhood I lived in, what's that going to do? As a matter of fact, the fact that they further decimated an already struggling community wouldn't help them much in terms of their street cred with other terrorists. So then for me, what I'm coming to believe is one of the ways in which we define terror and how the state should respond is how we value the object and people who are most likely to be impacted, actually or by the fear. Every single day, I remember going to work. I worked a lot of hours. I'm a workaholic, so I got up really early. I don't know about most people in other parts of the world, but in Chicago, most of the women I know traveled with some religious item. People said prayers before they left out of their houses. And at night, like I said, if you had to come back at nightfall, after the night sunset, you prayed to your God, your belief system, get me through. But I think those that we construct and define as terrorists have something in common with the United States government. Communities like the one in which I grew up in are less valued. Al-Qaeda's not interested in hitting that part of the U.S. Again, that's not going to get them street cred in the realm and reality in which they travel. The U.S. doesn't particularly value it as much. So the constant, perpetual terror that those communities live in, that's gang crime. It's not even defined as a national security issue. The other piece that I missed here is that the part that foreign actors play in radicalizing Americans and what we commonly call terrorism. Now in Chicago street gangs, I and others have been told by people in CPD, Chicago Police Department, that there are foreign actors from gangs outside of the United States of America that have for decades been coming in to recruit gangs from within American communities, societies, populations. Turn them out. They don't say radicalized. They didn't say grooming back in the day. That's what they were doing. But those persons in Woodlawn, the poorest parts of Woodlawn, and other parts of the city of Chicago that are plagued with violence, that's not a national security issue? Worthy of hundreds and hundreds of millions of think tank dollars pumped into think tanks? It's an inner city problem. But when it happens to an iconic space in one of the New York, that's a national security issue. Now, why would that be? Chicagoans are American citizens. They're part of what makes up the nation that is the U.S. And some of those U.S. citizens, Americans, are being terrorized by systematic and systemic violence. But that's not terror. I venture to say, and I would ask, and I ponder on the thought and I question, is it that crime is crime and it operates on a continuum, but because of the way in which we value property and human beings, some of it's terrorism and some of it is Chicago's gang problem? Or is it that it's terror and that operates on a continuum and some of it is high valued, quote unquote, iconic targets, and some of it is coming out of poor communities in Chicago? Is it that the valuation of the targets is what is defining what is terror as opposed to what's Chicago area street crime, gang crime? I'm beginning to think that, and I think it's better to say I've thought that for a while. This is Debra V. Wilson. I am in Canada. It is Tuesday, the 6th of March, 2018. Thank you.